Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today. We are going to be taking a really fascinating, structured dive into the ancient Hebrew kingdoms, guided by the incredible research of Dr. Jonathan Greer. If you love history, archaeology, and basically putting together thousand-year-old puzzle pieces, you are in the exact right place. We're going to look closely at what actually happens when the text of the Old Testament meets the dust of the ancient Near East. Okay, let's dive into this because right out of the gate, Dr. Greer challenges how we visualize this entire era. When you picture King David or King Solomon, you probably imagine a medieval paradigm, right? Towering stone castles, kings sitting on grand thrones, elaborate hierarchies. But recent research suggests we might need to flip that image entirely. What if this early monarchy was actually much closer to a sophisticated nomadic society, a network of incredibly wealthy, powerful chieftains operating out of vast, organized tent cities? It completely changes the way we look for evidence. To unravel all of this, we're going to treat this explainer like a grand archaeological detective story spanning hundreds of years. We'll be covering the early monarchy mystery, the great chronology debate, digging up David's era, the northern kingdom's rise, Hezekiah and the Assyrians, and finally, the fall of Jerusalem. All right, part 1, the early monarchy mystery, searching for Saul, David, and Solomon. We are looking at that fascinating transitional period in the Iron Age, where early Israel is shifting from a loose collection of tribal nomads into a centralized kingdom. But here is the absolute biggest headache that constantly frustrates archaeologists: the silence of the stones. In the 11th and 10th centuries BC, the exact time David and Solomon supposedly ruled this vast, wealthy mini-empire, there is literally zero mention of them. No inscriptions about a kingdom of Israel, nothing about David. It's just a massive historical puzzle. In fact, our absolute closest external clue doesn't even show up until just after Solomon, during the reign of his son, Rehoboam. Enter Egyptian pharaoh Shishak. He launches a military campaign into the region and carves his conquests right onto the walls of the great Karnak temple in Egypt. The itinerary he left behind maps out cities in the central hill country that perfectly correlate with biblical town names. But he still doesn't name the king. Frustrating, right? Which brings us to part 2, the great chronology debate, 10th versus 9th century origins. Because we don't have a name tag on these ancient ruins, the academic world has essentially turned into a battlefield over dating. Now, what's really interesting about this is how it breaks down into two perfectly opposing camps. On the high chronology side, championed by archaeologists like Ami Mazar, they look at massive, monumental architecture, like the incredible six-chambered gates found at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and date them to the 10th century, which aligns perfectly with Solomon. But on the low chronology side, led by Israel Finkelstein, all that dating is pushed forward a full century into the 9th century. So they attribute those exact same grand structures not to Solomon, but to the later Omride dynasty of the Northern Kingdom.
So you're probably asking, why can't science just give us the exact year? Well, radiocarbon dating has an inherent statistical variance, an error margin of about 75 to 100 years. And wouldn't you know it, that exact margin of error sits right on top of this controversial timeline. Science perfectly obscures the difference between the 10th century and the 9th century, leaving the debate wide open.
And we are talking about a massive scale here. Just look at the notes on Hazor. Casemate walls, vast guard towers, those multi-chambered gates. So I pose a rhetorical question to you. If you dig up a massive, heavily fortified wall without a name tag, who do you give the credit to? Solomon the wise king or a later dynasty? The debate is fierce. Let's move to section 3, digging up David's era. New paradigms in the dust. Things are getting really interesting because recent, highly charged excavations in Jerusalem and the surrounding valleys are actually reshaping our entire understanding of David's era. Take the stepped stone structure, for example. This is a massive, towering retaining wall built in the city of David to keep the early city from just sliding right down into the Kidron Valley. When you find an ancient retaining wall of this unbelievable scale, common sense and archaeological science tells you that something incredibly heavy and significant, like centralized royal architecture, had to be sitting on top of it. So the crucial point here is that we're finding a convergence of new evidence. We have 3 critical puzzle pieces pointing toward a powerful 10th century government extending its reach. First, Eilat Mazar's excavations revealing monumental architecture in the city of David. Second, the discovery of Khirbet Qeiyafa. These are early centralized fortresses out in the valleys built to protect against the Philistines. And third, Something truly mind-blowing out in the Edomite Arava Valley. 100,000, that is the staggering number of tons of copper slag identified at smelting sites out in this region, right alongside 10,000 mining shafts dating to this exact 11th and 10th century period. It is wild, and it brilliantly illustrates Dr. Greer's point from earlier. You do not need stone castles to have an empire. This level of unprecedented industrial production proves that immense wealth, power, and organization absolutely existed in a tent-dwelling nomadic society. Shifting gears now to Section 4, the Northern Kingdom's rise, the Omride dynasty. We're moving forward in time to the Northern Kingdom of Israel. This is where the fog of the 10th century finally lifts, and historical records and archaeology suddenly align to show undeniable international power under the Omrides. Now we finally start getting inscriptions that actually name names. A prime example is the Mesha stele, also known as the Moabite stone. This incredible ancient monument was commissioned by King Mesha of Moab, and he explicitly complains about the Omride oppression of Moab. It mentions the Moabite god Kamosh, and amazingly, it even mentions the Israelite god Yahweh. But perhaps even more monumental is a discovery from the 9th century found at Tel Dan. The Tel Dan stele is a boastful monument erected by an Aramaean king, basically taking credit for killing Israelite kings. And right there, carved into the stone, it explicitly mentions the House of David. This is a massive anchor point for archaeologists. It is the very first extra-biblical mention of King David's dynasty, proving that just a few generations after David, his dynastic name was recognized internationally. Section 5. Hezekiah and the Assyrians. The Clash of Empires. We are turning back to the southern kingdom of Judah now, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic, terrifying convergences of archaeology and biblical text in all of history. The year is 701 BC. The unstoppable Neo-Assyrian war machine is marching straight on Jerusalem. We actually have this chilling, direct quote from the Assyrian king Sennacherib regarding King Hezekiah. Sennacherib writes in his annals that he shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem famously like a bird in a cage. But notice what he doesn't say. He brags about trapping the king, sure, but he completely leaves out capturing the city or destroying it. This perfectly mirrors the biblical account, where Jerusalem miraculously survives the siege. And the archaeology backing up Hezekiah's terror is just palpable. You can physically see his frantic preparations to fortify Jerusalem against total annihilation. He ordered mass provisions stamped with LMLK, meaning for the king, to stockpile food. He commissioned a massive engineering project to carve a tunnel right through solid rock, redirecting the Gihon Springs so his people would have water during a siege. And he rapidly built the massive broad wall to enclose all the refugees fleeing into Jerusalem's unwalled western hill. And this brilliantly illustrates just how closely the dust matches the text. Following the siege, Hezekiah had to pay a massive ransom. The Assyrian war records state he paid 30 talents of gold, and the biblical text in the Old Testament also records exactly 30 talents of gold. While there's a slight discrepancy in the silver count, likely just due to differing accounting methods for physical tribute versus pure currency, the detail-level correspondence here is absolutely breathtaking. Section 6. The Fall of Jerusalem, Fire and Exile. Sadly, Judah only bought themselves a little bit of time. The Assyrian threat abruptly ends, only to be replaced by an even more ruthless power, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Before we get to Babylon, it's worth noting that Sennacherib's greatest victory wasn't actually Jerusalem. It was the nearby Judean city of Lachish. The horrific Assyrian palace reliefs showing the siege of Lachish perfectly match the physical siege ramps and destruction layers archaeologists have excavated there. The ancient world was incredibly brutal, and that exact brutality was inherited by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II. Let's move to this timeline and see how this builds, because you can literally trace the sequential collapse of these kingdoms. We see the Omrides flexing power at Karkar in 853 BC, but by 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Samaria falls to Assyria. Judah holds on, surviving Sennacherib in 701, but then Nebuchadnezzar arrives. A first incursion in 597 BC, followed by the absolute fiery destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in 586 BC. We even have ration lists found in Babylon naming Judean captives from this exact exile. Which brings us to a final, profound question to close out our explainer today. We've seen how radiocarbon dates, massive stone gates, scattered copper slag, and boastful enemy steles all converge in fascinating, hotly debated ways with ancient texts. It is a constantly shifting, incredibly dynamic field.
If ancient stone ruins and ration lists can already show us a world this vividly detailed, what on earth is still waiting to be discovered beneath the sand tomorrow? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep asking questions, and I will see you in the next explainer.